How many times as a network engineer have you wondered, how can I make my life easier? Well, hopefully this video will do just that, make your life a lot easier when it comes to stuff like network automation using tools like Ansible, because let's face it, we are living in the future now and we need to work a lot smarter these days and not necessarily harder. So let's get into the video and talk about Ansible. So what is Ansible? In essence, it is a wonderful open source software that we can use to automate processes on our network or even servers. I actually think more people tend to use Ansible for server automation as opposed to network automation. So it works wonderful for everything. So how does Ansible do its magic? Well, in essence, you will install Ansible on a single machine, namely a control node or a control host. This doesn't have to be a server, but you can install it on a server, but you could even have it running on a laptop. Doesn't matter. It works on various different devices. Now, what makes Ansible interesting is this control node will in essence be able to push configurations to remote nodes by remotely connecting to them agentlessly. Make that word bold, agentlessly, because it doesn't need any type of software installed on the remote nodes to be able to do anything. Ansible can connect various different ways to remote devices, but for networks you will typically see it using SSH to establish that connectivity and then to either push configuration, or Ansible will maybe pull some information off of remote networks to see stuff like software versions of your operating system, or if anything's outdated, or if any interfaces are maybe in a down or error state or something like that. So that makes Ansible really, really powerful. So how does Ansible do its magic? Well, it uses something called a playbook in order to run various different tasks against the network. So you could run a single or multiple tasks against a single or multiple devices, depending on how you structure your playbook. What makes the playbooks nice as well is they are written in the YAML language, YAML, which stands for yet another markup language. And this in essence is just there to make things very easy for us, because YAML is written in such a way that it's very similar to English. You read from left to right, and how they put the command structure and everything. It's so straightforward and easy for us as people to understand. So you could give a YAML file to somebody that's not a programmer. They can open it up and they can in essence understand what this file is doing, because you can see how the task is structured, what type of information it wants to gather, or what you want to configure. It's really awesome. So last thing I want to talk about is the Ansible inventory list, or the inventory file. Now, what is it exactly? Well, this is where you are going to be defining objects of different types of devices. Now, you can create single device lists here. You can group devices together. You can even do stuff like set variables for a device, or device groups in general, like what the username and password is to log into a device. It's really awesome. Now, that is really what you need to make Ansible work. You need a control node where you will be installing the Ansible configuration file on. You will be needing an inventory where you will be basically defining all of the devices you want to configure. And then lastly, you need your playbooks that you will be running with your control node in order to connect to devices in your inventory list to push or pull configuration. Now, that is really Ansible in a nutshell. What I do recommend you do is go look at the pinned comment in this video. I will post a link to the getting started as a network administrator engineer for Ansible for network automation, and then you can follow along with that. So let's actually configure Ansible and do some automation. Alrighty, so brand new Ubuntu 22.10 instance has been installed for this demonstration so that we can just have Ansible configured on a completely fresh setup. So let's actually get into that bit now. So first thing I recommend we do is actually get onto the Ansible documentation so that it gives us a better idea of what Ansible is, and that we can find our way around Ansible if we ever get lost and we need help figuring something out. I also highly recommend pinning Google or Stack Overflow somewhere so you can quickly also use that to search for possible questions or answers that you might have. But for our case, we're just going to get onto our browser, and then we're going to navigate to docs.ansible.com. github.com/ansible/latest. Hit enter, and now this brings up the Ansible documentation. So from here, gives us a great overview of what Ansible is. I highly recommend you look at the getting started with Ansible first, because this will tell you exactly what's happening with Ansible, what a control node, managed node, and inventory is, and just how everything kind of gels together. Next step is I recommend looking at the installation guides. Now with the installation guides, you have different ways to install Ansible. You can either use a package manager like pip to install Ansible, or you can do it with a specific operating system. So if you're using Fedora or CentOS, Ubuntu, Debian, there's specific ways to set that up and download the packages on those OSs. One thing I want to stress is with Windows, you will not be able to run Ansible as a control node on Windows. However, you will be able to orchestrate or manage Windows nodes from a Linux distribution. So let's just go into installing Ansible on a specific operating system. So I'm just going to follow along with this guide. But I do know, since I'm using the latest build of Ubuntu and it's not LTS, there's kind of like some missing packages for me, but no biggie. It just means I won't have the, let's say the example Ansible config file and the example host files, but that I will create myself. And I think that's a great way for you also just to see how the config file and the inventory list kind of works and functions. So I'm just going to follow these 4 steps exactly. I'll first just make sure that all my stuff is updated. So we'll do a sudo apt update. So let's quickly do that. And this might take a while since this is a fresh setup. Let's do an upgrade. I can also just copy the next commands along. So that's sudo apt install software -properties -common. So I'll just copy and paste that in as soon as the upgrade is actually finished. Alright, looks like our upgrade is finishing up, so let's continue to the next step. Let's paste sudo apt install software properties -common, and next bit is actually setting the PPA for Ansible. So let me copy paste this, and this might take a couple of seconds, maybe a little bit longer, but it doesn't typically take too long. Alright, so PPA has been set, but we can see there is some stuff here about release does not have a release file, and this is because I'm using this newer build of Ubuntu, whereas if you're using the previous version, the LTS version, I think it's 2204, the jammy version, the jellyfish thing, then you're totally fine. Then you'll have, again, example files. All right, so let's just finish it off by actually installing Ansible. So I can do a sudo apt install Ansible, and it's a little chunky, 362 meg, but it's not too bad. So we'll just wait for that to download and install now as well. So Ansible's setup is just finishing up right about now. So let's continue, and done. Now, what do we do next? How do we actually verify that Ansible is running on the system? Well, we can issue a very simple Ansible version command, and you can run this from anywhere. So from the terminal, let's just type in Ansible space -- version, hit enter, and it will tell you exactly what version of Ansible you're running, what the config file is, or where it's located, and all kinds of interesting and good to know bits of information. But I'm not totally happy now, because we don't have an example configuration file, or we don't have an inventory list either, so we need to create the stuff ourselves now. So this is where it's going to get really fun. So what I'm firstly going to do is I'm going to create a new directory in my desktop. So let's just quickly go there. Let's just create a new folder, call this Ansible Learning, hit enter. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to change to that directory from my terminal, so Ansible Learning, and let's create a new directory from here as well. Maybe just call this Ansible, so Ansible. And if I see or do an ls, I can see there is an Ansible folder basically. So let's change directory to this Ansible folder. And then from here, we need to firstly create our Ansible config file. Now I'm just going to grab a configuration file example from the website quickly, so we can actually check the Ansible guides, but I could also just quickly Google this ansible.cfg example. So I'll just go into this git example, and from here we can actually see it even gives us another example, which is a little bit more complete in my opinion for the stuff of things that you can tweak with your config file. So if we open this up, we can actually see some stuff like where your inventory is listed, but everything's hashed out. And that's the nice bit about it. These are just things that you can come in here and tweak if you ever really need to, or you're struggling with something and you find some advice on Stack Overflow of what you can fix, then this is where you can come and do that. So let me just open this up in raw, and I'll just copy this all into my Ansible. So select all, copy it, go into my terminal, and then I'll just nano a new file. Let me just make sure I sudo that, and I'll call this Ansible.cfg. Now this will be the Ansible configuration file. I can just scroll up here. Now inside the config file, we can actually set a very wide array of different variables or parameters of how we just want Ansible to interact with our system, or maybe where we store specific things, which is pretty cool. But you rarely come in here unless there's some specific case that you need to do something with, that you research online, you see, hey, I need to tweak this to maybe get a specific type of different result. But one thing that I'll typically come and tune here is where my inventory is, because your inventory in essence is where Ansible will be doing a lookup to look at what groups you've specified and how to log into those devices and all that wonderful bit. So I will just unhash this inventory line and I'll specify where my inventory file is going to be hosted. So this is going to be hosted under my desktop in the Ansible folder that I created. So I'm going to make this that squiggly line / desktop / Ansible learning / Ansible / hosts, because that is the hosts file that I need to use if I want to query the inventory. So let's just save this. And now we have the Ansible config file sorted out. So let's create an inventory list quickly that we can use with Ansible to reach specific devices and get across the network. So let me just exit out of here. So if I do an ls, I can see I only have my Ansible config file at the moment. So let's create a text file, just a very basic ini file where we can now add our groups of devices. So I will just do a sudo nano in the same folder. This is where I've specified where my inventory is, and I'll just call this hosts. Now I've got a very basic blank document. And again, if you go look at the Ansible documentation, you can actually look at how to build your inventory from here. So if I search inventory, it should actually give me a basic list of different possibilities of how we can access the inventory or build our inventory, just in further detail. But I'm going to do this very basic. So what you can do is you can specify brackets, which is just a box, and inside the box, whatever you put that name is a group of objects or a single device that you can reference using Ansible. So I might make this Files or MikroTik or Cisco or Juniper or whatever you want it to be. It doesn't need to be the operating system. This is just a name that you can use to reference. You could have made it routers or switches or whatever. Really cool. But I'm going to make this VIOS because this is all of my VIOS routers that I want to add in here. Next step is you can either use the IP address or the host name of the VIOS device. So I'm going to just use the IP addresses that I already know. Now I have 2 VIOS VMs also running on the same hypervisor where this Ubuntu VM connects to. So perfect, we can use them to actually lab with. So I know that the IPs are 192.168.149 and 145, and then 192.168.149 and 147. These are my 2 VIOS routers. Great, so I actually have a group specified. Now besides just adding a group, maybe we want to add specific variables for this group so that whenever Ansible needs to try and log in, it will know what the operating system is, it will know what login credentials to use, etc. So this is going to be very basic configuration of variables. So what I'll do is just create another box and I'll make it the same name. It is for the VIOS group, but if I make the semicolon there or the colon, I can now specify vars. So this is now going to be the variables for the VIOS group. Now I can start to add different variables, different things that I want Ansible to use. So maybe I want to specify what the username is that Ansible needs to use to log into these devices. So that would be Ansible_user equals VIOS. That is the default VIOS username. I can specify the password that Ansible can use to connect over SSH, which will be Ansible_password. And if you're concerned about this, there are different ways that Ansible can use passwords without it being in the clear text, but that is definitely a different subject. This is just going to be a quick and easy lab. So look at Ansible Vault if you're curious. Anyways, Ansible_password equals TMB123. Now we can also set the Ansible operating system or the network type, which is Ansible_network_OS equals, and this is going to be VIOS.VIOS.VIOS, 3 times the VIOS. This is where you could specify that what is this? Is it a Cisco? Is it a MikroTik? Is it a Juniper? Is it a Arista? What is this? Now the reason this is important is this will also determine what modules Ansible can use with the group or the devices. And basically what modules are in essence little programs that Ansible can also use to manage very specific parts of the configuration. Something like a login banner maybe, so that you want to set the banner to something custom and you can quickly and easily remove it using Ansible with states. Last step is I also just want to set how we're going to connect. So Ansible_connection, I'm going to make that network_CLI, and I'm happy with this. This is a very basic list of variables that we've set. So let's test them out. Let me save this. Let's quit. And let's actually see if we can access those machines by running a very basic ping from Ansible. So you could do something like Ansible, and now you can specify all your hosts or your group that you set up. So I'm going to make that vials, so Ansible vials minus m ping minus v. Let's hit enter, and network CLI not found. So it would help if I didn't make a typo earlier. So let's just quickly fix that just by going back into the file, and let's specify network CLI. So quick and easy to make mistakes like this, but there we go. So here we can see that Ansible actually did a ping, not a real ping, but it's basically just testing to see if it can actually log into the device and if it gets a response. And it did. It's able to log into these devices, it pings them, and the device sends a pong back, or it gets the pong back, and this is great. Another thing I want to show you with Ansible with your inventory is you can actually use the Ansible inventory -- list to see what your inventory is doing. So here you can actually see your variables, and you can also see which groups you have defined, which is super useful and nice to just quickly see how the inventory is structured. Another thing with Ansible, it is dependent on where you're currently in your file system as well, because currently I'm in desktop Ansible or Ansible Learning Ansible, and if I do an Ansible -- version, here I can see where my config file is listed. But if I just change back to my root directory and I do the same command, Ansible version, you can see it doesn't know where the config file is. So typically you'll want to go log in wherever you've placed your Ansible config file, and from there you'll start tweaking and connecting to your inventory and doing different things. Now let's actually get to the really cool part, which is the playbooks, because now I want to actually just set up a very basic playbook so that we can issue some commands or configurations to our remote nodes so that we can just do some stuff very quickly. So for our playbooks, what I'd recommend we firstly do is just go back onto our Ansible directory, so cd desktop Ansible learning, and from here I'm actually going to create a separate folder where I want to keep my playbooks, because I don't want my playbooks necessarily to be hanging around where my Ansible configuration and such is. So let's just create a new folder and call this playbooks. Let me just sudo this playbooks. Now I'm going to change directory into the playbooks so that I can actually create a YAML file in here that we can start to use for scripting or basically doing some stuff. So let's just do a sudo nano, let's call it first playbook.yml. That is just how you specify that it's a YAML file. Let's hit enter. And now we are in the text editor and we can start doing our magic. Now, whenever we start a YAML configuration, you always want to start off with the 3 dashes, because this is kind of just telling the file that it is a YAML script. And from there on out, it's going to be doing whatever is in the YAML script in a YAML way. Now, YAML, I want you to think of as having 2 sections. One section being where you define the parameters for the playbook, where you can set additional variables or specify where the host file is, or you can set stuff like the gather facts. That's the first section. And then the second section is where you actually specify the tasks, the plays, the stuff that you want to achieve using your playbook. Maybe grab specific information or configure specific stuff. And it'll make sense when I actually go and copy a playbook off of the Ansible website. So let's go to the Ansible site again. And I'm going to just scroll down to the network automation. And then with network getting started, this is going to be super cool. We can find run your first Ansible or run your first Ansible playbook. So from this playbook, we can actually now download the playbook, or I can just copy and paste it from this window and put it in this nano file. So let me just remove the 3 dashes quickly. And this is now a perfect example of how a YAML script functions or a playbook functions. We have the 3 dashes. Now we have where we specify the parameters. So this is the first section. So the name, your connection that you're going to use, are you gathering facts, what the hosts are, and then you've got your tasks section. And just like any other programming language, the indenture is very important. So if you see there's any spaces anywhere, like here, it's there for a reason. So you can just technically tab there in order to make the indenture like this. But we're going to leave everything exactly like it is, except maybe we will change our hosts to vials, which is the group that we created. And I'm just going to remove the connection bit because we've already defined that in our configuration file or our host file. So we don't need to define it again. We didn't have to do that. We could have had the variable in here and we didn't have to define the OS in the configuration file, if that makes sense. So let's just write out of this, because now we have a very basic YAML configuration that's just going to find out what the host name is of the device and what version it's using. Super cool. So let's save this. And what I'm going to do now is just go back into my Ansible directory. So let's go into Ansible. And what I'm going to do is run an Ansible playbook. So similarly to the Ansible -inventory, you've got Ansible -playbook. Now this tells Ansible that you want to run a playbook. So now let's define the playbook that we want to run. Now I know that this playbook is under, so I'm just going to make the squiggly line. It's under the desktop, Ansible Learning, Playbooks, and the playbook is firstplaybook.yaml. So I can just hit enter, and then this should in theory run the playbook for me. So let's see what it does. And it's failing because parameter authenticity of the host couldn't be established. Okay, because we haven't actually SSH'd onto those devices to do our RSA keys and such. So this we can fix quickly by either just SSHing onto those hosts quickly, or we can actually make a change to the Ansible config file to not check stuff like the fingerprints. But I like to just SSH on quickly, so let's just do that. SSH files at 192.168.149.145. So let's just save the fingerprint, and then I'll do the same for the second router, which was 147. Save the fingerprint, and there we go. We're on 2 devices. So let's run the same playbook again, and let's see what it comes back with now. So that's actually good. It gave us the error because you could see what an error looks like. Now we can see what it looks like when Ansible is successful, because it gives you a bunch of information like what tasks is running, what's happening with the task. So here's just displaying the information that we requested. So it can tell you the hostname is Vios and the OS is Vios and what the operating system version is. That is so cool. And I love that it shows you a play recap that tells you, has the task finished? Is it okay? Has it changed anything? In our case, it didn't change anything, so the color isn't changed. And then if anything's unreachable or failed or skipped, then it will tell you, which is super useful, because if I scroll up here, we can see the task failed because the RSA keys couldn't be confirmed. Awesome, I really love this. So let's actually do a little bit of configuration using Ansible. So for this, I'm actually just going to create a second playbook, and what I'd like to do is just also go onto the Ansible site, or I'll go onto Google, and I'll actually Google the following: Ansible Vios. Reason being is this should take us to the Vios module for Ansible, which we can use to issue Vios commands or do specific parts of configuration. So as you can see, there is a large different bunch of modules that you can use. I specifically want to use the Vios banner module, so we can get a banner whenever we log into the device, which is going to be super awesome for us. So if I scroll down, we can see there are some examples that we can use with our playbook, which is great because now we know exactly what we want to grab off of this. So let me go back onto my terminal. Let's just cd back. Let's change directory to our playbooks. So we can create a second playbook by either just starting from scratch, or we can copy our first playbook and just leverage some of the parameters that have already been filled in for us, which I like. So let's do that. So I'm going to copy my first playbook, and I'll call the new one second playbook.yaml. I'll hit enter, and now I should see that I have 2 playbooks. So let's nano the second playbook. So I'll do a sudo nano second playbook, and we can see it is a YAML script. We can see what the parameters are. So what I'd like to do is actually change my task. So let me just go back to the Ansible docs, and I will just grab this one example quickly. So I specifically maybe want to change the pre-login banner, which you see before you log into a device. So let me just copy this. And once I have copied this, I can actually just paste this into this nano box, but I'll have to paste it exactly where these other tasks are currently. Now here is definitely where it might be advantageous to use something like a code platform or program like Visual Studio Code, so you can just quickly do this, but I don't have that on me right now, so we'll just use good old nano and we'll just paste this in. But we need to understand that the indenture is very important. So if I run this playbook as it is with just copy pasting in here, I'm definitely going to run into some issues. So let me just move some of the stuff around. Let's do 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2, and that should be good. So let me just save this playbook where it's now going to update the pre-login. And actually, let's change the pre-login. Let's set this to something else. So let's not be boring about this. Let's say this is my awesome login banner. I hope you enjoy. Please log out if you are not authorized. So let's save this. And if I go back out and I change my directory back to the Ansible configuration, and I run a playbook now, so Ansible-playbook, and I run this against my squiggly line desktop, Ansible Learning, Ansible, playbook, which is where I saved my playbooks, and we run this second playbook, we should see that it actually does something. So let's see, it is running even though the title I should have changed, but it's changed some details. It's updated the login banners for these two devices now, so for 147 and 145. So if I now log on to one of these devices, so if I SSH onto BIOS at 145, so, okay, that was a bit of a oops. So let's just do that again. SSH BIOS at 192.168.149.145. We can see that we actually get a very badly grammared authorized there, but we can see that the login banner has been updated. And you can do it for the post login banner as well. And it doesn't just need to be banners. Again, if we go back onto the Ansible site and we look at the different modules, there's so much that you can configure and get things for and change states for. Like you can even do stuff like the route configuration or BGP configs or your interfaces or everything. Now this is really just the tip of the iceberg for Ansible, but I think this should at least show you enough to get you started where you can create your own playbooks, and now you know where to come to get some more information and just mess around. Please don't do this on production environments because you can potentially mess something up. I highly encourage you to get some VMs running, set up a little bit of a lab network for yourself, and then play around on there. And then once you feel comfortable with your automation, then start taking that to your production environment. Because I can promise you, the moment you are comfortable with stuff like Ansible, you are going to be so good at automating everything and making your life so much easier. Anyways, I'm going to end off the video here. I'd like to thank you guys for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. See you soon.